Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hi everyone, I'm Crystal Contreras and I'm the director of Inform at the Commonwealth Club. Welcome to tonight's program with New York Times correspondents Shira Frankel and Cecilia Kang. We're here in honor of their best-selling new book, An Ugly Truth, Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination. This conversation will be moderated by Emily Chang, anchor and executive producer at Bloomberg Technology and author of Brotopia, Breaking Up the Boys Club of Silicon Valley. If you'd like to ask any of our speakers a question during this program, you can do so in the chat or comment section of the live stream that you're currently watching. The Commonwealth Club is going full speed ahead with the full slate of live and online programming this summer and fall. We ask that you consider donating to the club to help us continue our work this year and beyond. Please visit us at commonwealthclub.org/online to learn more, and you can also click the donate button you see to the right side of your screen live during this program. Now, please join me in welcoming Shira Frankel, Cecilia Kang, and Emily Chang to Inform.
Thank you, Crystal, and thank you everyone for joining us. Cecilia and Shira, congratulations. It's great to have you. I've been covering Facebook for many years, but even I learned from your book. And it is, I didn't get it, An Ugly Truth, Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination. It details the rise of Facebook to global popularity, its fall into the depths of what some might describe as conspiracy peddling and hate mongering. And we are taking questions, so please submit them as they come to mind. I want to start with David Kirkpatrick, who wrote the original Facebook book, The Facebook Effect, who told me he thinks that your book is, quote, a litany of crimes meticulously reported. I'd love to hear, in a nutshell, those crimes. Please lay them out for our audience. Who wants to go first?
Well, I just think that's, I take that as a compliment from David, because he really, as you said, wrote the first book about Facebook. And it's a fantastic book about the early days of Facebook. And we honestly learned so much from his book because it laid out who Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg are as people. And when you ask me about crimes, what I actually think about are patterns. And what our book demonstrates is that patterns that were established really early on in the company's founding, the growth metric, growth as any cost, move fast and break things, other expressions which involve expletives, which I'm not going to repeat here, for engineers to ship out products as quickly as possible. All of that continue to drive Facebook, and it is core to how people at that company function. And so whatever has happened, whether it is data privacy breaches, people's personal data being misused by engineers at the company, hate speech, misinformation, election interference, all of that stems back to Facebook, A, needing to grow as quickly as possible, and B, needing to essentially have an algorithm dominating their platform to keep you invested as a user as many hours of the day as they possibly can, so that they can continue that growth.
Now, the consequences of the crimes, or whatever you want to call them, are, monumental, right? Possibly life and death. So with the election, for example, do you think that Donald Trump would have been elected? Cecilia, you can take this one, without Facebook.
Well, I think it's undeniable that Facebook was a huge platform for Donald Trump. He had 30 million users, followers actually on the platform. I think it's also really important to know that Facebook helped make Donald Trump. He used the platform better than so many other politicians, particularly in the US before him. And he was able to exploit really the business model, which had political ads that were targeted to particular demographics. And he was able to exploit really the algorithms that we go into so deeply in the book to get his content to the top of news feeds, to get that conversation going. He understood how to drive attention and conversation. So as to whether he could have won without Facebook, I think it's undeniable that Facebook and his use of social media was core to his success.
How do you think the book is being covered and received? And by the way, instant national bestseller, it's being reviewed in a lot of places. Do you feel that others feel the alarm that you're trying to convey in the book?
I think that we know that lawmakers are reading our book. We know that people in Washington are reading it and taking out of it lessons. And we have heard from some of them that they are alarmed, that they do see things in our book which are a huge cause for concern. I think we were sort of curious to see how Facebook was going to respond, and particularly executives. Were they going to feel some of that alarm? Were they perhaps going to do more than apologize, but rather recognize some of the errors in the past? And it's been interesting. Mark Zuckerberg's only given one interview since our book came out, and he spent that talking about the metaverse, the idea of wanting to create a comprehensive universe in which people will live their whole lives. And sort of if you've watched Ready Player One, that's the idea. And that to me doesn't read as someone who's alarmed about what he's created or really spending time at the moment thinking about some of the problems our book really, catalogs.
Well, I actually did get a comment from Facebook on your book. So here's what they told me. By the way, there have been rave reviews. Facebook's review, not so rave, not surprisingly. They say this book presents a false narrative that relies heavily on anecdotes supplied by mostly unnamed critics. We made 24 executives available for interviews, and the authors had an opportunity to ask any questions they wanted. Instead, they purposefully left these perspectives out of the book. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think Facebook is really used to controlling the message. And we did talk to dozens of executives, highest level executives that they had supplied to us, but also that we had been able to secure interviews with on our own. And what the executives that they often supplied to us were, what they said were oftentimes very much, they hand very closely to their PR messaging points. And it's not useful, I think, for our readers to hear sort of evading the questions, talking points that don't necessarily really address some of our core problems and questions that we're trying to explore, which are the different episodes that we explore, like Russian interference, privacy abuses, misinformation on the election, as well as COVID. These are really important, very key problems that the company has faced. And oftentimes the executives didn't address that. I do want to address one thing about the people who we spoke to. We spoke to almost more than 400 people. The vast majority of those people are employees, current and former. Many are current employees. They're absolutely not disgruntled. Many of them are very happy to be at Facebook. They believe in the potential of Facebook. They really want to see Facebook change and make better decisions. They want to see the executive leadership make better decisions. So the idea that they were disgruntled is sort of a disservice to them. They spoke to us often at great risk because they really wanted what they believed to be the truth to be presented in our book. So we're grateful to them.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing, which is, one thing we show in our book and in our articles for the New York Times, that Facebook has a pattern of delay, deny, deflect. And for me, that response by them is such deflection. They may have made executives available, but, I remember those meetings well. When we asked them about particular scenes and particular meetings, they would often give a line of, well, I can't remember that meeting on that day, but misinformation and election interference is something that plagues every social media company, and we take it seriously. Now, if readers found that particular quote illuminating, then maybe we should have included it. But to us, the many, many sources who spoke in detail about meetings were more important to include in the book than really vague PR statements that people have probably read in dozens of news articles until now.
You didn't talk to Mark Zuckerberg for the book, right? And you say at the outset that you did a few off the records with Sheryl, but that those could not be used. Yeah. Do you think that if either of them had spoken to you on the record, that would have influenced the ultimate product?
It depends on what they said. It's hard to say without knowing if they were willing to sit with us and give real answers, right? To account for their behavior at that time. Mark Zuckerberg, why didn't you ask for regular meetings on Russian election interference once you were told that it was a problem? Sheryl Sandberg, why did you say what you said to members of Congress? Were you not reading your own security team's reports? If they were willing to give us real answers, we'd love to include that, because I think Cecilia and I often, even now wonder that ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So as a journalist, and I'm sure you get this question too for the various people that you cover, I often get the question, do you think Mark Zuckerberg is a bad person or Sheryl Sandberg is a bad person? Are they malicious? Did they intend for these problems? Was there some sort of directional, path here that they were following? Can you answer that question? How do you answer that question? Is it malicious? Are they malicious? Are they naive? Or neither?
I think that the memo that Andrew Bosworth, the vice president, wrote, and where the title of our book comes from, it's called The Ugly, really encapsulates a lot of their motivation. I think Facebook understands that because they believe so strongly in what they say is connecting the world, that's sort of a euphemism for growing and scaling, that there will be collateral damage, there will be consequences, and they've accepted that. That's the calculus. So I think that when they think long term, they believe that history will judge them well, because in the end, connecting the world or growth in their minds is a de facto good thing. That's quoted in Andrew Bosworth's memo. So that's the kind of way that I think that they process what's happening right now at Facebook. They believe that there are definitely mistakes and they feel badly about some of the mistakes, but until growth is no longer the number one objective, and that driving into new markets and creating new technologies that potentially are dangerous, and not really having a security apparatus in place that catches up to all of that growth, they're going to be faced with these same problems over and over again. So as far as whether they're malicious or not, it's, I don't think we can say. We can only judge by their actions and by the way that what we understand very clearly is the way that they process the sort of dichotomy that they face with growth coming with consequences.
So, there are so many themes in the book, but one overarching one seems to be Facebook is too big, and there are many problems that come from that. I mean, obviously, there's so much in the history. The election the 2016 election has come and gone. But what are the problems that you see happening at Facebook right now that you want to raise that alarm about?
You just mentioned the 2016 elections having come and gone, and it's true, they have. But the problems that were raised in that election, and which, by the way, resurfaced in 2020, are affecting countries all over the world. The idea that you're going to create a carve out for politicians, for elected leaders to be able to say things that the average user cannot say led to problems here in the United States. Let's not forget, during the pandemic, when Donald Trump said that UV light and disinfectants could be a cure or a treatment for COVID, and Facebook allowed that to stand on the platform because they had created a carve out for the president. There are currently presidents and prime ministers in other countries that are using that carve out in a similar way, and including in countries like Hungary and the Philippines that have elections coming up this year. They can't afford to wait for Facebook to make up its mind on elected leaders. They can't afford to wait the 2 years for Donald Trump to be eligible to come back on the platform for Facebook to make these kinds of critical decisions.
What about the response? Facebook is just a mirror for society. Should they really hold up a mirror that's better than it looks?
Well, I think this idea that Facebook is just a mirror for society and is a neutral platform would be true if they didn't have algorithmic amplification that really drove the technology, that drove the content that you see at the top of your newsfeed, that recommends certain groups that you should enter, that gets conversation really circling around the most emotive content that makes you angry or fearful or happy or what have you. That is actually is what makes it not neutral. So the idea that they are just representing what people say is not necessarily true, because they're also trying to tell you what perhaps you might find most interesting, not necessarily just reflecting what people are saying generally in the platform. So it's not like every voice has equal measure. It's the voices that have the loudest, sort of the most cantankerous, sometimes some of the most seductive and rancorous kind of conversational content, like appeal, is what drives conversation.
I'm curious how your reporting process evolved, because even going back to like 2008, 2009, it almost seemed like regulators were on to Facebook's privacy issues, but didn't carry that forward. What happened? Why not?
Yeah, we really explored this in depth. Washington really dropped the ball in many ways. They began to take notice in 2007 when Facebook introduced this advertising program called Beacon. And it was a big privacy debacle. And it was a first realization by the public that Facebook had so much control over your data and they could actually expose you in many ways. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, took notice and they eventually reached a settlement with Facebook on this. But there was never any legislation that was created, a comprehensive privacy regulation in the United States. there was never really any true accounting for the company, no oversight of the company. Right now, the internet companies in the US are just not even regulated. I think there's a combination of things. I think Facebook and other internet companies were held in such high regard for so long, and particularly over the Obama administration. And I think that there was a real reluctance to squash this very bright light in the economy, especially after the recession. There was this idea that these companies were generating jobs and they were so great and they were cool and they were interesting and innovative. And I think that that was something that Facebook and other companies really rode on for quite some time. And the other thing is, I think Facebook has an enormously powerful, as do other internet companies, Facebook has an enormously powerful lobbying operation in Washington. Right now, they have the biggest lobbying operation of any US company in Washington. And those lobbyists, their number one job is to protect the business. And that means slowing down regulation that can truly affect their bottom line and can truly slow down their business model. Facebook says in every single ad that anyone who's on this right now on this program has seen on TV, newspapers, everywhere, they say they embrace regulation, but truly regulation that addresses algorithmic amplification and behavioral advertising is something that they are not necessarily willing to address.
So I remember that photograph of President Obama in, I don't know, I think it was 2010, he's seated between Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs. And it's dinner with 10 or 12 tech leaders. Do you think the Obama administration gave big tech a pass?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people in retrospect would say that the Obama administration did. They approved some of the biggest mergers during the Obama administration. The Obama administration's FTC did. They approved Facebook's acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp in 2012 and 2014. They allowed for Google to also approve to merge with many other companies as well as other big tech companies. So yes, in terms of consolidation, yes. There was also no legislation that was enacted during that time. It was just a time where Facebook and other internet companies got a big pass. The other thing is, we write in the book that there was such a revolving door too between government and Silicon Valley companies, where you had a lot of leadership coming from Google and Facebook in and out of the Obama administration. And during this very formative and important time, Facebook hired people directly from the White House, like Marnie Levine, who's now the chief business officer of Facebook, as well as other officials from the White House directly. So there was just so much commingling, and there was just such a relationship that was interlocked. And I do think that it's easy to judge in retrospect, but certainly now I think it's unmistakable that some of the most consequential decisions related to mergers happened then, as well as no regulation.
So what's the solution? Is it regulation, and is that regulation going to happen? Because a judge just dismissed the FTC lawsuit and the one coming from the states as well. The judge saying they didn't do enough to prove that Facebook is a monopoly. And, you have multiple big tech companies now asking for Lina Khan, the chair of the FTC, to recuse herself from big tech investigations. So if regulation is the solution, then there's the question of whether or not any regulation will actually come to pass.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a big, messy fight for many years. I definitely think that's true. But I do think history is a guide here. I think every single communications platform has become regulated, starting from the telephone to public airwaves, to broadcast TV, to cable TV, to broadband internet. Everything becomes regulated at some point. It's just such a powerful and important part of who we are as Americans to have communications tools with some sort of guardrails involved in it. I do think that it's going to be hard. It's going to be really hard to regulate speech. And that's probably the thorniest thing and the most pressing problem right now, misinformation on Facebook. As far as antitrust goes and breaking up the company, I mean, there is a lot of will right now in Washington. There is definitely people who are they're not at all hiding the fact that they want to break up Facebook. I mean, this is what the FTC, as well as members of Congress, have been aiming for. The courts are going to be a big problem. The courts are conservative on antitrust. So it's going to be a big fight. But I also do think that if anything, it's going to be a slog for Facebook too, because having to deal with an antitrust case that drags on for a long time is hard on the companies, maybe not so hard on resources, but reputationally and otherwise as well as a distraction.
I just want to remind our audience, we are taking questions at the end of this, so please submit them as they come to mind. Some of the most fascinating parts of the book are your analysis, your reporting on the evolution of Mark and Cheryl's relationship. Talk to us about what you learned about how that relationship changed over the years, for better or for worse.
In the outset, we really wanted to understand them as people and what drew them to each other. And it sort of became clear that initially they served a function for one another. Mark needed Cheryl and Cheryl needed Mark. He didn't want to deal with Washington. He didn't want to deal with policy things, policy questions, and he wanted someone who was going to help him monetize the company. And Sheryl Sandberg was coming from a place at Google where she'd kind of risen as far as she could. And she wanted to take that next step. She wanted to be a bigger name, maybe, set out for herself as an individual, as a C-suite executive. And so initially, it just seems like they have this great honeymoon phase where they are really, in terms of being business partners, in lockstep with what they are getting from the other. And as you enter sort of the Trump years, which is the part that our book focuses on, you see Trump as a president not just test Facebook and what its policies are, but test Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg's relationship, because repeatedly she is in disagreement with him over calls he makes on Trump. She's got to answer to lawmakers in Washington, especially those in the Democratic Party that she's been close to for some time. And I think she kind of sees him taking missteps. One example of this in our book is when a video of Nancy Pelosi is uploaded, which is doctored to make it seem as if she's inebriated. And Sheryl Sandberg looks at that and says, we should take this down. It's clearly misleading people who cannot tell it's been edited, and it's making the Speaker of the House look inebriated when she was not. And Mark Zuckerberg kind of makes this odd call where he says, well, it's not a deep fake. And so we'll take down deep fakes, but not doctored videos. I want to note that right after he made that call, it was repeatedly challenged, because how do you draw the line there between what's a deep fake and what's doctored? And it's such a gray, such a strange line to have to walk, really. And so we see her voice not being heard. And I think ultimately we end the book on this note of, Sheryl Sandberg largely being sidelined at the company.
Which Facebook would push back on, and I actually remember having her on my show as some of your reporting was coming out last year. And she said, my role at the company hasn't changed. And many of these people that we're hiring, they report to me. They don't report to Mark. And so what's your response to that?
Well, I think,
I was just going to say, I think a really important thing to remember, though, is that she is still important in one very important, very, very crucial way. She still runs the business. The business is incredibly successful. The business has had $85 billion in revenue last year. The shareholders have shown how appreciative they are. The company's now valued at $1 trillion oftentimes in the market. So she still has a vital role. As far as all the other things that she dealt with, these big policy decisions, engaging with Washington communications, she has a lesser role. I mean, I think one executive put it well when this person said to us, it used to be that Facebook had a number one and a number two, Mark and Cheryl. Now Facebook has a number one and many. So there are other people who are taking more of the kind of taking over some of those responsibilities she had. But importantly, Mark Zuckerberg is taking over many more of those decisions as well. And I also think it's really interesting to see, we were surprised to discover that Sheryl Sandberg was supposed to be sort of a balance to Mark. She was supposed to provide balance to Mark and maybe sort of balance out his not so great instincts sometimes. She's supposed to be in many ways the adult in the room when she was hired, is how many people described her early on. And she actually didn't push back as strongly as we thought she might have. I think she was very careful to choose her fights. I think she was afraid of upsetting Mark too much. And that surprised us because in a way, she did have a lot of power and authority. This is Mark's company, absolutely. But if anybody could have stood up to him, it would have been her. And instead, we found that not only did she not push back that much, but he oftentimes cast blame on her for a lot of the public image fallouts for Facebook, when a lot of the problems stem from his side of the business, the product side. So it was a very fraught relationship towards it currently even, but especially over the last 4 years that really surprised us, and we spool out in the book.
Your excerpt, I believe the wording was something like, their relationship did not survive the Trump administration. And how do you know for sure? We, of course, I believe on the same day that broke, saw them walking together at Sun Valley. What do you believe the state of their relationship is right now? And what's the evidence you have to support that?
Well, we've spoken to executives that work with them day in, day out, people on the M team close to Mark, as well as people close to Sheryl Sandberg, who just have bluntly said to us, no matter which side of that they're on, whether they're Mark's people or Sheryl's people, that the relationship is not what it once was. It's no coincidence that when our book excerpt came out, they did that. I would note, quite staged walk together in Sun Valley. They hadn't been photographed together in Sun Valley for quite some time. And I think that was meant to be a bit of a PR move to counteract what our excerpt said. It doesn't change what people close to them are saying, which is that they are not as close as they once were. And that Mark has many people that he goes to for advice now, whether on policy decisions in Washington or what's coming down the road in Europe, that he did not formally have, and that Mark is empowered. He's empowered himself to make decisions that he formally outsourced to people like Sheryl Sandberg or other executives. And so, I just think that those many executives at the top that we've spoken to, they've been in lockstep about this. They say that it's just unequivocal that their relationship has shifted and it's not what it once was.
Now, as Cecilia mentioned, Facebook just reported its latest quarter, bigger than ever. I believe they're on track to hit $100 billion in revenue. For the first time, almost 3 billion users across Facebook's family of apps. And, kind of despite all of the reputational issues, your reporting, the reporting of others, Facebook continues to grow. And so, do you think that any of this will ever actually impact the size of the company? Like, do you think the company will ever slow down? It seems like there have been so many, if quarter after quarter, we ask analysts, like, is this the beginning of something? And it just never is. The company keeps growing.
Right. I mean, they keep growing because they're growing in other markets largely. Mm-hmm. They know that they've plateaued in the United States and Europe, which are incredibly lucrative markets for them, and that they're really losing followers among young Americans and young Europeans. I think that is something that is very concerning to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. As long as they have those other markets to grow in, they'll continue to show a great bottom line, right? That they'll continue to show fantastic numbers. And really, as long as they have those other apps, the WhatsApp and the Instagram, whatnot, are fueling a lot of that growth. But, reputationally, they've taken really serious hits. One of the things we have in our last chapters is that for years, Facebook has been asking its own users, do you think we're good for the world? Do you think that we care about people? And those numbers plummeted following the revelations of Russian election interference, following the revelations of Cambridge Analytica. They've never recovered. And I think any analyst looking at that is going to say, right, like, if the average person doesn't believe that you care about the world or that you're good for people, and you're a social media platform that relies on people sharing cute photos of their dogs and their children, sooner or later that's going to come back, and that's going to have an effect on the bottom line.
So do you think Facebook will keep getting bigger, or at some point will it not? And how much bigger will Facebook get?
I was really interested to hear in that earnings call and in past earnings calls how much they are concerned about Apple's move when it comes to data tracking on apps, and how they believe that decision by Apple to make it harder essentially to collect data within apps that go through the App Store will create headwinds for Facebook and their business model. So it was interesting for me because that was a marketplace sort of activity that was having an effect on Facebook. It was absolutely external. It was not regulatory. It was a decision by another company. So that struck me as quite interesting, how the market can move things for Facebook. The other thing that I do think regulation, though it could take a long time and move forward. I was really intrigued also by hearing from the FTC recently that they're thinking much more hard and closely. They're looking more closely at algorithmic amplification. They're looking at behavioral data, business models, advertising models, things that I had not heard before. This is like the first time I've heard actually regulators talking about these things that I think really address the heart of how Facebook functions and works and succeeds. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, the forces will be external for sure. If there's going to be any sort of change to the business, Mark Zuckerberg is not leaving anytime soon, and he's still the majority voting shareholder. So these external forces are interesting. I don't know how much effect they'll have, though.
I'm curious how the reporting and writing process evolved because, oftentimes the book you start out to write doesn't end up being the book that you actually write, and you learn so many new things along the way. What did you intend for this book to begin to be when you started? And how did that change as you moved forward?
It's funny. In some ways it didn't, in some ways we kind of came full circle.
Yeah.
We started off with wanting to do a book of investigative journalism because that's what we had done with our article, and that's what Cecilia and I really are. And along the way, we sort of at times toyed with the idea of having it be a book more of arguments and ideas, and perhaps shifting the focus slightly. And I think we ultimately came back to where we started, which was that we really wanted it to be like a fast-paced read, a bit of a page turner for people, and we wanted it to be driven by plots and scenes and characters that the reader would walk away feeling like they truly understood who these people were and what the room felt like when they made decisions. The one thing that did change is the timeline. We started writing this book nearly 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
And we had originally thought that we might publish it even and have it out before the 2020 elections. That obviously changed as the 2020 elections neared. And we realized that Facebook's role was going to be incredibly interesting and consequential. And that the test of what happened on November 6th was going to have to make it into the book. And then obviously when November 6th didn't prove to be quite as decisive a day as some people thought it was going to be, it extended out from there. I think in some ways we could have kept this book going for months and months and never ended it.
Speaking of the characters and the color, I mean, I know you've talked to so many employees, you still talk to employees. You said that many of them are happy. And I often talk to people who work at Facebook who are like, it's great. It's a great place to work. They amazing benefits, certainly see the problems. Actually, for many of the employees I talk to, the toughest part is the reputational issues, which, and of course, this is all anecdotal. They don't necessarily feel within the company. What do employees tell you? If the alarm is not shared within, will change actually happen? That was a lot of questions.
I think I think those are all good questions. I think that people are happy. What I mean by that, the people who we do talk to who are happy, they're happy with the potential of Facebook. Sometimes they're happy with whatever they're working on. I think they're very distraught by some of the decisions that they see leadership make. When Mark Zuckerberg told staff at a Q&A that explained why he decided to keep Trump's post after the George Floyd protests, where Trump was essentially warning that looting leads to shooting, it was incredibly painful for a lot of employees. And as we know, and we've all reported on this, there was a virtual walkout. This was during COVID lockdown. Many people told me that was a breaking point for them, that was just like the straw that broke the camel's back for them, that it was just too much. Like they were able to accept some of the lines that they thought were crossed, but because they believed that the company was working on it, they were their problems. They were hiring thousands of moderators. They're expanding the security team, that they were at least on the right track. And internally, they hear a lot from executives about how much they care and how much they do want to fix the problem. But I do think that there is oftentimes a lot of ambivalence, even among the people who say they're happy with their jobs and happy with the potential. I think they also absorb and they understand that Facebook has a lot of problems. I do think a lot of people want to be part of something that could be big and consequential, and they are part of something that's big and consequential. They're just really distraught. And one of the reasons why they talk to us is because they want us to understand that, as well as they want to understand what's really happening, not just beyond the talking points that Facebook presents.
I want to add that, I've heard from a lot of Facebook employees since the book came out. And these are people that still work at the company, talk to us. If you ask them, do you like your job? They'd say, yeah, I love my job. I love my colleagues. I love the benefits. I even like the special project I'm working on. And they speak to us because there's a part of the company or a meeting or a situation that happened that they're not comfortable with, that they want to come to light so that executives are pressured to do differently next time. And as Cecilia said, I just think there's this hope among many of them that by staying at Facebook, they'll help fix some of those wrongs.
As you mentioned at the beginning, Mark is talking a lot about the metaverse now. He's very excited about this convergence of physical and digital worlds and wants Facebook to own that. How do you feel about that?
It's so Mark. I mean, it's everyone I've spoken to recently has just been, of course, right? Of course, Mark wants this. Mark's a product guy. He's started off as a product guy and still is. And whatever the new shiny thing is that people in tech are chasing, whether that's blockchain currency, like Libra, the one he started, or now the metaverse, that's what Mark is interested in being in, because he's still the guy that's looking around his shoulder, making sure that some new tech startup doesn't come along the way and boot Facebook out of its position as being the global leader in social media. Let's remember, Facebook did this to MySpace, right? They did this to other companies. So he's aware that a company can come along and eventually make Facebook obsolete.
I feel like we talked a little bit more about Sheryl than Mark. How has he evolved over the years? In some ways, it almost seems like he cares less about Facebook's image than he did. He's almost maturing a bit, cracking jokes at himself. There was that 4th of July thing, which I think it was a joke. I think it was a joke. I certainly got a laugh. Is it better to be understood than liked from his perspective?
Yeah, I think he's remarkably consistent in many ways. And I think that still stands true. It's better to be understood than liked, as he has said. Look, we have watched Mark Zuckerberg grow up in front of our eyes. We have watched him create a website. Many of us were the earliest users. We've watched him from his earliest post-college years, wearing his Adidas flip-flops, which I guess he still wears. At the Sun Valley video, he was still wearing those. But, and to somebody who has one of the biggest foundations and has, is meeting with people like Anthony Fauci and talking about really big policy issues and global leaders. I think that, we are watching him mature, and unfortunately I believe that we're watching him evolve and mature with his decisions and that maturation is reflected in his decisions. He is making a lot of these big decisions on speech, and particularly in a very ad hoc fashion. He comes out with a very declarative speech at Georgetown University in 2019 where he lays out his vision for free expression and why Facebook should allow politicians to essentially flout every other rule that every other user has to abide by. And he explains that his vision is that, Facebook's a fifth estate and that that the public will fact check politicians, et cetera. And then we see, actually the politicians are really going to test that much more than you expected. So we see him vacillate and we see him sort of evolve and change his mind on certain things, at least little by little. He's iterating, if you will, as Silicon Valley people say, like on his vision of speech. So I think he's in many ways remarkably consistent in that I believe he believes strongly in himself and he has an incredible confidence in his own thinking and his ideas. He's still incredibly competitive and ambitious. This is why he has introduced the idea of the metaverse and his interest in it. None of this has changed from even his middle school days. I think that we're only seeing his maturation and evolution in that he wants to be more of a public figure. Before, he didn't seem to care, but we're seeing that he wants to be respected more as a public figure.
Do you think that'll happen?
It could, depending on what happens. He's got years ahead of him. He's still young. He's in his late 30s. As far as, company chief executives go, he's fairly young. I think that Mark takes a very historic view of his own reputation, and he sort of imagines in 100 years, when history books note the first truly global social media company, they'll note him. And he thinks about how they're going to see his decisions in 100 years' time. And I imagine from speaking to people close to him that he thinks that overwhelmingly he'll be seen as a positive figure and not a negative one. This is a person who studies the Roman Empire for fun. So his view of these things, I think, is slightly different. He doesn't think or care much about daily headlines.
So we're about 10 minutes away from Q&A. I love the way you describe Facebook at the outset, saying it's the most consequential social experiment of our time. How do you expect that experiment to evolve? If this is, the last decade or two, what does the next one hold?
I think they're going to have to contend with what it means to be global. I mean, that's something I think I come back to often. It created this platform based on rules that work for European and American countries with our sort of democratic norms, our tendencies towards free speech, our values of free speech, also our institutions like a free press and NGOs and think tanks. They are now operating in a number of countries that don't have those things. Myanmar is a very famous worst case scenario that we cover in our book, but there are many other countries out there, autocracies, dictatorships, monarchies, that are using Facebook in ways that really challenge how Facebook was created and what Facebook's rules are. And if Facebook continues to try to seek this one size fits all approach, I think they're going to keep running into really serious problems, including, I think, unfortunately, people who get killed as a result of things said on Facebook. And so contending with that, what does a global company do in the face of that? I think is going to be something that's incredibly important in the next decade.
Myanmar is a really powerful example of how Facebook can, and if you want to attribute the blame to Facebook, can go wrong. For our audience, I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand exactly what's going on there. What is happening in Myanmar, and how is Facebook, in your view, responsible?
Well, in our book, we look at the introduction of the internet to Myanmar, which really means the introduction of Facebook. This is a country that came online through cell phones in 2015, and Facebook, through telecommunication companies, really aggressively pushed its product into the country. But without any media literacy, what happened, and I was there on the ground when this happened, so I remember the conversations with people, they didn't understand that they were putting something online that anyone could see, including the government. So you had a lot of arrests of activists, of LGBT activists and human rights workers. And they also didn't understand, because no one had talked to them about it or told them, that things on Facebook weren't vetted. There was this idea, well, it's an American company. They're a wealthy American Silicon Valley company. If I see something there, it must be real. It must be fact checked. I can't tell you how many people told me that whatever was on Facebook was fact checked. And it didn't matter how many times I said to them, no, Facebook doesn't work that way. They're not fact checking this content. I remember really vividly, someone showed me an ISIS video of that had been shot in northern Syria of members of ISIS beheading people. And I said to them, this is a video that was shot in Syria. And they said, no, this is a video in Thailand, and it shows Rohingya Muslims killing Buddhists. And I said, no, that's definitely not what this video is. I'm telling you, I can show you here. It came from this source. They didn't believe me, they believed Facebook. And so I think to understand what happened with the hate speech in Myanmar, with the subsequent genocide that happened in Myanmar, you have to understand that this was a country really fueled by anger over what they saw on Facebook.
I know, obviously the election is such a huge, incredible example of the power of Facebook. And I wonder, we talk so much about Mark and Cheryl, but I wonder how much blame you ascribe to the employees. So for example, the Russian meddling that, employees saw obviously before Mark and Cheryl ever knew. Do you think there was a cover up, or do you think it was more sort of naivete about what was actually happening, how important it was to disclose, and the possible consequences? And if so, is it something more cultural, or is it really something that we lay blame at the feet of the people running this company?
Well, I do think it's really important to understand structural and cultural problems there. And there were warnings. The security team was warning from very early on, well beyond a year before any of this became public. They were sending reports to their managers, warning, explaining what they were seeing on the site. And they were seeing interference, and they were seeing the IRA backed ads that were being purchased. And when I mentioned cultural and structural, they were telling their managers, who were telling their managers, which led up all the way to the general counsel and all the way up to Elliot Schrage, who is the VP of comms at the time. And at that level, those individuals were saying, well, look, do you actually really have enough information? Is it really clear? And the security team was sort of screaming, yes, we do. This is a huge problem. And culturally, so that's just one of the structural problems. So they didn't bring those reports up to Mark and Cheryl. And culturally, it's important to understand that there's not a lot of incentive at Facebook to bring difficult information or news that is not really, sort of the kind of information that Mark and Cheryl are part of driving the company business forward. So all of these things are nuisances in a way. And so the company does not have the incentive to look around the corner for problems because those are not about growth. So culturally, there's not a real push to actually bring upsetting and problematic warnings to the top leadership. So, and we show that in these chapters related to Russia. And I think that's really important to understand in how Facebook functions and why the leadership is when you ask about blame, a lot of it goes back to the top leadership and the culture they set.
I mean, something managers say to us is there's also a level of plausible deniability here. Mark and Cheryl did not ask for daily or even weekly reports, even once the Russia problem was brought to their attention. When they have that first meeting just weeks after the 2016 elections, and Alex Stamos, the then head of security, says to Mark and Cheryl, no, definitely something happened on Facebook. We know something weird has happened and we're trying to get to the bottom of it. They at that point do not ask for weekly meetings. And so it becomes easy for them to continue to say in meetings with lawmakers and meetings with other executives, oh, well, we found whatever we need to have found and we've gotten to the bottom of it. And I just think that I've had people at Facebook say to me, well, Mark and Cheryl have such important things on their plates every single day. How could you expect them to pay attention to everything? And my answer is always, well, I don't know. I would think that if you were chief executive of a company and your head of security said Russia used Facebook to interfere in the US elections, that to me sounds like an alarm bell moment. And I think it took nearly a year for it to become an alarm bell moment for Mark Zuckerberg.
We're just starting to get questions from the audience now. So since we're on the subject of employees, do you think that employees working on the inside have the ability to change the culture that you portrayed in the book, the parts that you believe are toxic, or is Facebook too far gone to change course now?
Well, I was just going to say that we show in the book that the employees that really did try to ring alarm bells, the whistleblowers, if you will, they were essentially dismissed. Alex Stamos, Yael Eisestat, she was working on election integrity and she was trying to warn of problems and trying to implement policies that would create better safeguards. And she was essentially dismissed as well. And so there is a pattern within Facebook where internally, if you do try to ruffle feathers too much and you do try to bring bad news up the chain, that you're not rewarded for that. I do think that they're concerned about a broad employee uprising, if you will, or some sort of a walkout or people leaving too much because they care so much about the engineering talent in particular that they have. But the examples that we show and we found in reporting this book is that actually, aside from the very, very top ranks, there's not a lot of power under that.
So if Facebook employees, this is another question, are mostly happy and legislators are largely tech illiterate, where is the best place to look for accountability? By the way, I think legislators are starting to catch on.
Yeah, I think
the more recent
better.
Hearings the legislators have been much more educated.
Legislators are more educated and employees are more educated. I think it's both, to be honest. And I do think employees are challenging their leadership more and more and saying they want change. Just in the last year alone, the number of employees that have asked questions of the leadership in which they've insisted and said, no, we're seeing the news reports and we don't just want a rote PR answer here. We want something more definitive, right? I think that in a small way is change as well.
Let's talk about the emerging threats, because so much about the story of Facebook is getting rid of threats that are in the way or trying to neutralize them. Are there any emerging competitors on the horizon that you see that could be a real threat to Facebook? And of course, that's also Instagram and WhatsApp, which are stronger than ever.
Yeah. I think this is what keeps Mark up at night. I think he's incredibly nervous about the popularity and rise of TikTok. and he evokes TikTok in meetings with, politicians, warning about the Chinese type internet and Chinese apps, becoming dominant. I think he's really concerned about what's around the corner. This is why he's very interested in blockchain and the Libra project, which is now called Diem. This is why he's thinking about the metaverse and why he's so obsessed with AR and VR. He's sort of like a shark, he just feels like he can't sleep, he has to always swim, and I think most tech CEOs are like that. But yeah, I think that the emerging threats to him are business for sure. We do know in our conversations that he feels incredibly emboldened right now, and that the U.S. District Court threw out that lawsuit from the FTC and states. Those entities, those government officials are going to refile. But yes, he feels right now that one of the biggest obstacles, a very existential threat of breaking up the company, is now at least temporarily and more than temporarily removed.
When you said most tech CEOs are like that, I instantly thought, is there something though that's different about Mark Zuckerberg than other tech CEOs? Because he is, at this point, I mean, he's probably the most recognizable tech CEO. And do you think there's something different about his psyche or the way he leads or the way he competes than Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs or, there's a short list actually. Elon Musk, there's another one.
In some ways he sort of is the model for those, right? And Mark Zuckerberg, I think he took advice and he learned very much from the people that were around when he started Facebook, like Steve Jobs, in that he made sure that his power was more absolute than others who had come before him. He is the majority stakeholder. He is the chief executive, the founder. He structured this company in a way that nobody could wrest control away from him. And he doesn't seem inclined to step down in the way that some other people, I think, would have. You have to remember he was also much younger than many of his sort of counterparts in that list that you just gave. He's much, much younger. So I think he's also planning on sticking around longer before he moves on to that next thing, whether, as Bill Gates did, moving on to the foundation. Mark has the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation that people have talked about him eventually moving on towards. But I think he's going to sit at the top of Facebook for a long time.
Do you have a pulse on this? Is a question from the audience. It's a good one. Do you have a pulse on how Facebook's board members feel about him now, especially how to manage him in light of these issues? Do any of them have more influence than the others? I.e., question asked, could we see the board attempt to oust Zuckerberg?
They can't. They don't have the power to do that. So, I think it's really important to understand that the board is sort of a paper tiger. It's like it's an advisory board. I mean, Donald Graham, the former chairman of the Washington Post, described it that way to us in our reporting, is that, really, we're there to give advice. We don't really have a lot of power over a lot of the big decisions. The new slate, and a lot of the board is new over the last year. The new slate of board members, I don't have a great feel, except for that it's a little bit more of the same, that they do advise. The board members who have recently left over the last year were really respected people of politics, leadership, business, et cetera. There's Ken Chenault, there was Erskine Bowles, there was Jeff Zients. There are a lot of people who have since left. Susan Desmond-Hellmann left as well, right? Yeah, she left as well. So all very respected in their fields. Our reporting has shown that they were very discontent with the way that Facebook handled Russian interference on the site, how they handled Cambridge Analytica. They also felt that there was a lot of maybe disproportionate public backlash, maybe media backlash as well. Media coverage was too harsh. So they really balanced sort of a defensiveness of the company with real concerns about some of the decisions that were happening. Our understanding is a lot of the board members were very upset with the decisions related to Trump.
What was the influence, or what's been the influence of Peter Thiel?
It's a great, yeah, we get this one a lot. I think people are interested in him. There's no doubt he was an early mentor to Mark Zuckerberg and an early influence in his life. And I think that a lot of Peter Thiel's ideas about libertarianism and free speech, ideas which I'll add are shared by someone like Mark Andreessen, who we also see as being a huge influence to Mark Zuckerberg. That, Mark comes into this and he is young, he is interested in what he's interested in, but as we document in the book, he's not much of a reader. He's not sitting around reading dozens of books about sort of the thinking of the day around free speech. And so I think that it's incredibly powerful for him to encounter Mark Andreessen's and Peter Thiel's ideas and to implement them as his own. And then, to kind of, I imagine over the years to say, this also makes great business sense. If I can say that as a CEO, as a chief executive, I should not be making really big sweeping decisions about content because it violates free speech, and that also is great for my business, you can see how that's attractive.
What are your thoughts on the oversight board? Are they independent? Is Zuckerberg happy with them? Do they have much power at all?
Yeah. So the oversight board is independent, absolutely, in that it was created by a trust, and structurally they're independent. Then they've made some really interesting decisions. I think the decision that they made to toss back a final judgment on whether Trump should stay or not on the platform back to Facebook was a really smart one, and because they essentially said, you can't ask us to make that decision when you don't even have clear rules in place for how you deal with political figures and how you deal with misinformation that they spew. So that was a smart thing, because essentially they were telling Facebook, start doing the work, start creating like real policies that are consistent and clear to the public. So that was smart. Well, the amount of power they have is, it's not a lot, in the sense that they take only a few cases that they can handle at a time. They recommend decisions to Facebook. Not all the decisions are binding. So it's like there's definitely more that they could be taking on to be truly effective. I mean, so right now they're sort of a symbolic Supreme Court. They're not in effect dealing with the scale of content and the many, many borderline and dicey decisions that Facebook has to make every day.
I sometimes think of it as they're a Supreme Court that hasn't been given a full body of laws to make decisions on. Facebook has, as Cecilia said earlier, made so many ad hoc decisions that if you are going to liken them to a Supreme Court, you have to imagine that that's a frustrating thing to try and create rulings or judgments off of.
This is an interesting question. Do you think that Cheryl's lean-in era was part of her downfall? How does that play into your narrative? And downfall is obviously a loaded term. Not everyone might agree with that term. It's used in a question.
Yeah.
Downfall. No, downfall doesn't quite, I wouldn't use that word. I think that, Lean In helped establish Sheryl Sandberg as a figure outside of Facebook, which is something she very much wanted. Reputationally, she did not want to be linked to Facebook as tightly as Mark Zuckerberg has been linked to Facebook. I think that, at the time that it came out, it said a lot of things about women in the workforce that hadn't been consolidated in that particular way and given that platform. I think that she's obviously run into problems in the years since then, because ideas around women in the workforce and what should be expected of them have evolved. And now reading that book, it does feel like that book, we've heard many feminists say this, the book comes off as a bit dated. And so I do wonder if that hasn't damaged her in recent years, the kind of coupling of the ideas in Lean In being dated and reputationally the damage she's sustained at Facebook.
Do you think, I feel like this question's been asked ever since I started covering Facebook 10 years ago, but will Sheryl stay? How long will Sheryl stay at Facebook?
It's her decision to make. Again, she's incredibly important in that she still runs the business side, and the business side is very successful. And so she's critically valued and important in that way. Does she want to leave now with Facebook in such a reputational low and with her name and her image attached to it? Everyone tells us no, absolutely not. She would not leave on a low note. So it's her decision to make. And the question is, does she have options to get out? And so, it's, is even a CEO path in some other company even possible at this point? I mean, potentially, but I think that she would want, from everything that we know about her after reporting quite a bit about her, I just don't see her leaving on any sort of terms that aren't just all completely positive, So it's her decision to make, though.
All right, so we have one more Facebook related question, and I have one more not related to Facebook question, but how can we prevent a repeat of the Facebook trajectory on social media platforms to come? It's a good one.
I think that companies making different decisions around responsibility, privacy, data usage on their platform would be interesting to see. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the companies, and I'll put TikTok in this boat, are making a lot of the same mistakes as Facebook in terms of hate speech and misinformation, rather than learning from the outset from the mistakes that Facebook made. And then I'll also say that, people themselves, thinking before you share something. If you respond really emotionally to a post, maybe double check it. Maybe it is too good to be true. Maybe that headline isn't totally accurate. And us, as consumers, having a bit more media literacy going into our engagement with a social media platform, I think that could have a huge effect.
All right. So the last question, and you both, I'd like you both to answer it. It's a tradition here at the Commonwealth Club. What is your 60-second idea to change the world? Shira, you're first.
Oh no, a 4-day work week and a year parental leave for anyone planning on becoming a parent.
I love that. Cecilia?
Okay, so I have something kind of related. I think universal free childcare, for across the board, free childcare would be incredibly liberating for so many families, so many individuals, single parents, across the income ladder. Just make it free from birth to the beginning of school, free. Like, forget other social safety net things. Like, I just think that would be, the cost of childcare is so disproportionately high and it completely encumbers so many people's lives and their ability to work, but not only to rise up the ladder, as Cheryl was saying, lean in, but even to fundamentally be able to work.
Can you tell that we're both working moms?
Hey, I've got 4, so I'm right there with you. I think both of those ideas would greatly change the world. So thank you both. Congratulations, Shira Frankel, Cecilia Kong, for joining us at Inform at the Commonwealth Club. Their book, An Ugly Truth, Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination, is on sale now. You can watch more virtual programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming by visiting commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Emily Chang. Thanks so much for joining us. And congrats again, Cecilia and Shira, on your book. Best of luck as you continue your tour. Thank you, everyone.
Emily, thank you so much.
All right, take care.